Sina Frostwood was told to stay in the kitchens. She was the shadow to her sister's son, the scarred, useless half-breed kept hidden so as not to offend their royal guest. The great hall of Frostwood Keep was a cavernous expanse of ancient stone, vaulted ceilings and towering stained glass, built to intimidate lesser packs and house the pride of a dying lineage. Tonight it was meant to be a stage. 700 years of history had been scrubbed, polished, and draped in velvet for a single hour of diplomacy. But underneath the grandeur, the keep was freezing. The cold seeped through the floorboards, crept up the tapestries, and settled deep into the bones of anyone who dared to stand still. Sina did not stand still. She remained on her bruised knees, her hands black with soot, dragging the heavy bristles of a hearth brush across the blackened stones of the main fireplace. The ash was thick, gritty, and reeked of charred pine. It coated her fingernails and settled into the jagged, raised lines of the scars that marred her forearms and collarbone. Her family called them an abomination, a curse left behind by a mother she had never known. The dormant runes formed an intricate, chaotic web of raised flesh that pulsed with a dull, distant ache whenever the temperature dropped. Sina ignored the pain. She gripped the ash shovel, scraping the iron edge against the masonry to collect the remnants of yesterday's fire. The sound was harsh, a rhythmic grating that echoed in the vast, empty space of the hall. "Quietly, you wretched thing." Morgana's voice cut through the cavernous room like a physical blow. The older woman stood near the center of the dais, inspecting the long oak dining table with a critical, venomous eye. Morgana Frostwood wore a gown of deep emerald, her posture rigid, her face pinched with the anxiety of a matriarch desperately clinging to relevance. She despised the soot-stained girl by the hearth. She despised the fact that her husband's blood ran in the veins of a creature so devoid of beauty and grace, but most of all, she despised the scars. Senna did not flinch. She did not look up. She merely adjusted her grip on the ash shovel and slowed her movements, muting the scrape of metal against stone. The wall inside Senna's chest was gone. She had not built another. There was nothing left for Morgana's cruelty to strike against, no fragile hope waiting to be shattered. The girl had learned long ago that silence was the only armor that did not rust. A sudden burst of light and motion filled the upper gallery. Elara Frostwood descended the grand staircase, moving as if she already wore a crown. The golden daughter of the house was draped in crimson silk that flowed like liquid fire around her ankles. Diamonds glittered at her throat, and her blonde hair had been pinned up in an intricate crown of braids. She was perfection, a meticulously crafted weapon designed to secure the survival of the Frostwood pack. "Is it too much?" Elara asked, pausing on the final step to twirl. The silk whispered against the stone. "Mother, do you think he will find the crimson too aggressive? They say the northern beasts prefer submissive omegas. Perhaps I should wear the white." "You will wear the red," Morgana snapped, though her gaze softened as she looked upon her trueborn child. "You are not a common omega meant to be cowed. You are the future queen of the north. When King Valerius arrives, you will stand tall. You will let him see the purity of your bloodline. You are the prize that will seal the Silver Treaty." Sena kept her head bowed, sweeping a final pile of soot onto the shovel. The Silver Treaty. It was all the household had spoken of for 6 months. A desperate political maneuver to bind their failing, impoverished territory to the supreme power of the sovereign. Alpha King Valerius was expanding his borders, swallowing lesser packs with ruthless efficiency. Garrick Frostwood, in a rare moment of cunning, had offered his most beautiful daughter to stay the conqueror's hand. Elara glided across the hall, her silk skirts brushing dangerously close to the filthy hearth. She paused, looking down at the kneeling girl with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "Make sure she is gone before the horns sound," the Golden Sister murmured, stepping back as if the poverty might be contagious. "If Valerius Stormvanger sees a creature like that crawling around our floors, he might rethink the alliance entirely. He is a man of immaculate tastes. He does not tolerate filth. Sina did not speak. She did not defend herself. She dumped the ashes into an iron bucket, the dust rising in a grey cloud that coated her frayed, threadbare dress. She was not angry at the beautiful girl in the crimson gown. The emotion required energy. It required a belief that things should be different. All Sina knew was the weight of the brush, the sting of her cracked knuckles, and the endless, numbing cold. Heavy footsteps echoed from the eastern corridor. Garrick Frostwood burst into the hall, his face pale, his ceremonial uniform sitting awkwardly on his aging frame. He smelled of stale sweat and cheap wine, the scent of a man who knew he was outmatched by the game he was playing. In his trembling hands, he carried an ancient, ornate goblet, the lunar chalice. It was brimming with dark red wine, meant to be offered as the first drink of hospitality. "They have crossed the outer bridge," Garrick gasped, wiping his brow. "His vanguard is already in the courtyard. The storm is blinding, but they rode straight through it. By the goddess, the size of his wolves, the pack alpha's eyes darted around the room, ensuring every banner was straight, every candle lit. Then his gaze snagged on the dark, kneeling figure by the fireplace, his face twisted in panic. "Why is she still here?" Garrick hissed. The massive double doors at the far end of the hall groaned beneath the weight of the wind outside. There was no time. The servants' passageway was entirely across the room. He rushed forward, shoving the heavy silver goblet into Sina's soot-stained hands. "Stand in the alcove. Press yourself into the shadows and do not move. You will hold the lunar chalice until I summon for it. If you drop it, if you make a single sound to ruin this night, I will leave you in the frozen woods myself." Cessna stood slowly. Her joints ached from hours on the cold stone. She did not look at her father. She merely gripped the heavy silver stem of the lunar chalice, bowed her head, and retreated into the dark, recessed alcove beside the hearth. Odelia Sterling, the head of the kitchens, emerged from a side door, just as Senna stepped into the shadows. The older woman possessed a round, weathered face and a heart far too soft for the brutal reality of the pack hierarchy. She wore a thick woolen shawl over her apron, her breath visible in the freezing air of the hall. "There you are, child," Odelia whispered, slipping into the alcove beside her. She reached out with a clean, damp cloth, wiping the ash from Sina's cheek. The cloth was warm. It was the only warmth the scarred girl had felt all day. "They are terrified out there," Odelia murmured, her eyes flicking toward Garrick, who was shaking so hard he could barely stand straight. "And they should be. The things they say about this king. They say Valerius Stormvanger was cursed by the Ancient Ones, that his blood runs as cold as glacier water. He slaughters rival alphas without shifting, tearing them apart with his bare hands. He brings the winter with him. Goddess, protect us." "Because a monster can protect you from other monsters," Senna thought, though she kept the words behind her teeth. Suddenly her collarbone began to burn. Senna gasped, a quiet, sharp intake of breath. The dormant runes, the ugly, raised scars that had been dead and silent her entire life, were suddenly throbbing. It was not the dull ache of the cold. It was heat. A piercing, vibrant heat that felt like a localized fever beneath her skin. The sensation was terrifying. Her pulse pounded in her ears, matching a distant, rhythmic thudding that was vibrating through the ancient stones of the keep. The heavy oak doors of the great hall groaned again. Down below, Garrick, Morgana, and Elara arranged themselves at the base of the dais. A contingent of Frostwood guards stood by the entrance, their spears trembling in their hands. The rhythmic thudding grew louder. It was the sound of iron-shod boots marching in perfect, lethal unison. With a deafening crack, the massive double doors were shoved open. The blizzard screamed into the hall. A tempest of white snow and howling wind ripped through the entrance, extinguishing half the candles in an instant. The banners snapped violently against the stone walls, and then the storm seemed to step aside. The entourage entered first. 10 towering warriors draped in pelts of black and silver, their eyes glowing with the lethal intent of battle-hardened predators. They did not walk, they glided, forming a protective crescent around the entrance. Then, Valerius Stormvanger crossed the threshold. He did not look like a man seeking a bride. He looked like a god of war stepping onto a battlefield. He was impossibly tall, his shoulders broad enough to eclipse the doorway. A heavy cloak of dark obsidian fur was clasped at his neck by a chain of solid iron. His face was a masterpiece of harsh angles and lethal beauty, carved from marble and winter ice. The sheer suffocating aura of his power rolled off him in physical waves, pressing down on the chests of everyone in the room. In the shadows of the alcove, Sina could not breathe. The heat radiating from her dormant runes was becoming unbearable. A branding irons pressed directly against her soul. Her wolf, silent for 20 years, clawed at the inside of her ribs. Down in the hall, the silence was absolute. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Garrick stepped forward, bowing so low his forehead nearly brushed the stone floor. "My Lord King, welcome to Frostwood Keep. We are deeply honored by your presence." Valerius did not respond. He did not blink. He stood perfectly still, his massive frame radiating a terrifying, unnatural stillness. Morgana nudged her daughter. Ilara stepped forward, her crimson silk flashing in the dim light. She sank into a flawless curtsy, holding out a silver scroll tube resting on a velvet cushion. "Your Majesty," Ilara spoke, her voice laced with practiced honey. "I am Ilara. I present the Silver Treaty. I am ready to bind my life to yours, to serve the North, and to stand by your side." It was the perfect greeting, the culmination of months of planning. Ilara looked breathtaking, a jewel offered to a conqueror. In the alcove, the searing pain in Senna's scars spiked into pure agony. The heat was blinding, her muscles spasmed violently, her numb, soot-stained fingers lost all feeling, slipping against the polished metal. The lunar chalice fell from her hands. It struck the stone floor with a sharp, ringing crash that shattered the absolute silence of the great hall. The heavy silver cup bounced, spilling a dark, spreading pool of red wine across the ancient flagstones. As Sina lunged to catch it, the jagged, ornate edge of the chalice sliced deeply across her palms. Blood welled from the cuts, hot and brilliant red, mixing instantly with the spilled wine. Senna gasped, clutching her bleeding hands to her chest. She froze in the shadows, expecting the wrath of her father, expecting Morgana to scream. But no one moved. A heavy, unnatural stillness descended upon the room. The scent of her blood hit the freezing air. It was a faint ribbon of metallic sweetness, cutting through the smells of charred pine, wet snow, and cheap wine. At the center of the hall, Alpha King Valerius Stormvanger froze. He did not look at the velvet cushion. He did not look at the Silver Treaty. He did not acknowledge the golden daughter kneeling before him. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame, snapping the iron clasp of his cloak. His eyes, the color of a raging winter storm, widened. The terrifying, calculating calm of the sovereign shattered in an instant, replaced by the raw, unhinged intensity of a feral beast that just found water in a desert. His head snapped to the right. He looked past the kneeling pack Alpha. He looked past the mother. He looked past the beautiful bride in crimson silk. His storm-grey gaze cut directly across the cavernous room, piercing the gloom, and locked flawlessly, unerringly, onto the dark alcove where the blood had spilled. The air had turned to glass in her lungs. The distance between them was vast, separated by 50 feet of stone, a royal entourage, and an entire family of nobility. It did not matter. The bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock. The terrifying King of the North was looking directly into her eyes. The silence in the grand hall stretched until it threatened to snap the ancient wooden rafters. No one drew a breath. Valerius did not merely look at the shadow hiding in the distant alcove. He devoured her with his gaze. The feral intensity burning within those storm-grey eyes was absolute. A sudden, violent conflagration that obliterated the carefully orchestrated diplomacy of the evening. The towering god of winter had found his solitary point of focus, Then the statue of ice and wrath moved. He took a single step forward. The heavy thud of his iron-shod boot striking the stone flagstones echoed like the first beat of a war drum. The crowd of cowering nobles scrambled backward in blind panic. They parted like a fractured sea, desperate to remove themselves from the lethal trajectory of his advance. Silk tore. Velvet was trampled. Aristocrats tripped over their own expensive finery to clear a path. The towering predator did not spare the elite members of the court a single glance. His focus remained exclusively pinned to the dark, soot-stained corridor where the blood of the lunar chalice had pooled. Realizing the catastrophic shift in the monarch's attention, the host's face drained of all healthy color. The cowardly pack leader scrambled forward, his ceremonial medals clinking pathetically against his trembling chest. Garrick snatched a polished silver tray from a paralyzed attendant, hoping to intercept the conqueror with a fresh offering of aged spirits to distract him from the shadows. "Your Majesty, please," the older man stammered, stepping recklessly into the direct line of the Alpha's advance. He held out the gleaming metal platter as if it were a fragile shield against a hurricane. "The grand feast is prepared in the adjoining eastern wing. This corridor is merely the scullery access. It is not fit for your eyes." Valerius did not slow down. He did not break his stride. A low, vibrating rumble emanated from deep within his chest, a sound so ancient and primal it made the crystal chandeliers tremble violently overhead. With a mere flick of his massive shoulder, he shoved past the terrified host. The metallic tray clattered violently to the floor, its contents spilled uselessly. "Forgotten. My lord, I beg you to stop!" The matriarch's voice cracked, sharp and shrill. She completely broke diplomatic protocol in her sheer desperation. Morgana lunged forward, grabbing the absolute edge of the King's Guard's defensive formation, though she dared not lay a finger on the sovereign himself. She placed her rigid body between the approaching giant and the dark entrance of the passageway. Her deep emerald gown shimmered under the erratic candlelight as she shook. "There is nothing in that darkness for you, sire. She is a mistake. A deformed, half-breed kitchen maid meant to be kept permanently out of sight. Her mind is as broken as her face. Please, I implore you, look upon my true-born daughter, Elara. We have the alliance." He stopped. The sheer force of his sudden physical stillness was infinitely more terrifying than his violent momentum. Valerius slowly turned his head to look down at the older woman. The ambient temperature in the cavernous room plummeted below freezing. Frost began to literally crystallize along the threaded edges of the heavy wall tapestries nearest to him. His gaze held no fiery anger, only the cold, unfeeling promise of an open grave. The absolute lack of mercy in his expression was suffocating. The cruel stepmother choked on her own desperate breath. She stumbled backward. Her knees gave way beneath the crushing weight of his dominant aura, collapsing onto the frozen masonry without another word. In the suffocating darkness of the narrow passageway, Cinna watched the nightmare unfold. Her lungs completely refused to expand. The heat radiating from her dormant runes was agonizing, searing through her delicate veins with a relentless, thrumming rhythm. It felt as though her very blood was boiling, demanding she step out into the torchlight to meet the predator approaching her sanctuary. She fought the unnatural instinct with every ounce of her willpower. She was a ghost, a thing of ash and hidden corners. She backed away deeper into the gloom. The blood from the broken lunar chalice still dripped from her trembling fingertips, thick and warm. The metallic sweetness of it filled the freezing air, a raw, unadulterated blend of wild winter moonflower and spilled life. It cut through the stale odors of Frostwood Keep like a sharpened blade. It was a beacon. He was following the scent of her pain. The giant breached the threshold of the servant's alcove. The most powerful ruler in the known realm, draped in immaculate obsidian fur and lethal black iron, stepped deliberately into the filthy ash-choked shadows of the scullery doorway. He loomed over her. His impossibly broad shoulders completely blocked out the ambient candlelight from the great hall behind him, plunging them both into an intimate, suffocating dusk. Sena braced her trembling body for the inevitable strike. She fully expected a brutal, humiliating command. She anticipated a heavy hand wrapping around her throat to drag her out before the court like a disobedient cur. She squeezed her silver-grey eyes shut, pulling her bleeding palms tightly against her chest to protect her core. The strike never came. Instead, the distinct, heavy sound of metal armor hitting the stone floor echoed in the small, enclosed space. He had dropped to his knees. Her eyes flew open in absolute shock. The sovereign was kneeling in the soot and the dust. The terrifying god of war had willingly lowered his massive frame into the filth, bringing his face completely level with hers. He reached out. His massive, battle-calloused hands were visibly shaking. It was not a tremor of rage, but a terrifying, desperate reverence. He gently, agonizingly slowly, pried her defensive arms away from her chest. She lacked the physical strength to resist the sheer, magnetic pull of the biological bond that practically hummed like a live wire between their proximity. When his bare fingers finally brushed against her soot-stained knuckles, a violent spark of warmth shot up her arm. The agonizing, fiery burn of her dormant runes instantly dissolved into a soothing golden hum. The localized fever beneath her skin settled into a deep, rhythmic purr of absolute rightness. He lowered his head. The conqueror pressed his lips directly to the raw, bleeding cuts on her palms, the wounds left by the shattered lunar chalice. He kissed the raised, ugly scars that her family had mocked for 2 decades. He kissed the dark ash covering her skin. His storm-grey eyes fluttered shut as a ragged, broken sigh escaped his broad chest. It was the devastating sound of a starving man tasting his very first drop of pure rain after a lifetime in the desert. "Found you," he whispered against her trembling, scarred fingers. The voice was impossibly deep, raspy, and vibrating with an emotion so fierce it defied all political logic. No spirit is too shattered to deserve grace. The quiet truth surfaced in the silence of her mind as his warmth seeped into her bones. Senna stared at the kneeling man, entirely paralyzed. This was the legendary monster they all feared, the Glacier King who slaughtered rival alphas without even bothering to shift into his beast form. Yet, here he was, kneeling before a ruined, discarded girl, treating her broken skin as if it were the most precious spun glass in the universe. He did not ask for her permission. He reached up with one hand, unfastening the heavy iron clasps situated at his throat. His massive cloak fell from his wide shoulders, a masterpiece of thick pelts and woven magic. He gathered the heavy, fur-lined garment and wrapped it securely around her shivering, threadbare frame. The residual heat of his powerful body enveloped her instantly. He smelled strongly of dark cedar, fresh snow, and terrifying, unyielding power. For the first time in her miserable existence, the freezing dampness of the ancient keep could not touch her flesh. She was entirely engulfed in his unique scent, completely shielded by his personal armor, not used, not owned, chosen. The silent, world-altering realization blossomed in the center of her chest, fragile, but undeniably real. A piercing, hysterical shriek shattered the intimate, heavy quiet of the alcove. No! The Golden Sister burst through the defensive line of the King's Guard, her flawless aristocratic composure entirely obliterated. Ilara's beautiful face was twisted into a hideous, unrecognizable mask of pure jealousy and unhinged rage. The expensive crimson silk ripped loudly as she stomped toward the passageway, her eyes wide with manic, sputtering disbelief. The ultimate public humiliation had completely broken her fragile sanity. The visiting monarch, the man meant to be her crowning prize, was kneeling in the dirt for the pathetic, invisible half-breed she treated worse than a stray dog. "Get away from him, you filthy creature!" Ilara shrieked at the top of her lungs, launching herself recklessly into the shadowy corridor. She raised a delicate hand, her manicured nails aimed directly at Sena's face. intending to physically strike the servant back into her proper, submissive place. The retaliation was instantaneous and devastating. Valerius did not even bother to look at the attacker. He smoothly shifted his considerable weight, shielding the huddled, cloaked figure completely behind his own body. He released a lethal, floor-shaking growl. The sound was not human. It was the pure, unfiltered wrath of an apex predator defending its newly claimed mate. The sonic force of the Alpha Command slammed into the enclosed space. Solid stone cracked visibly along the vaulted archways. Several tall stained glass windows high above the main hall shattered outward simultaneously, raining a cascade of glittering, colorful dust out into the howling blizzard. Elara hit an invisible, solid wall of sheer dominance. The immense pressure of his unleashed aura dropped her violently to her hands and knees. She gasped for air, clawing frantically at her own throat as all the oxygen was violently sucked from the corridor. Dark blood began to drip slowly from her nose. She could not move forward. None of them could. Every single noble, every armed guard, and every member of the host family was instantly pinned to the floor by the suffocating, crushing atmospheric weight of the king's unhinged power. He stood up slowly. His movements were deliberate and terrifying. He kept one fiercely protective hand resting firmly on the fur-draped shoulder of the girl, seated behind him. The glacial ice had returned to his eyes, sharper and infinitely more merciless than before. "She is mine," Valerius stated. The words were not loud, yet they reverberated in the marrow of every wolf present, sealing the lore of the fated bond in blood and magic. He glared down at the cowering host family, ensuring his absolute, unspoken threat was understood. "The feast is over. Clear the hall." No one dared to argue. The evening had ended with a catastrophic restructuring of power. The shadow had become the sun. Dawn came grey and cold, stripping the last illusions of grandeur from Frostwood Keep. The blizzard had finally broken during the early hours of the morning. It left the jagged battlements of the ancient fortress encased in a blinding sheet of ice. The freezing air stung the lungs, but it carried a profound, heavy silence. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. That is what her family had believed all these years, keeping her hidden and unloved. Instead, the turning of the sun brought the beginning of her vindication. Out in the frost-covered main courtyard, the massive obsidian carriage waited. 6 heavily muscled warhorses stamped their hooves against the cobblestones. They exhaled thick plumes of white vapor into the freezing air. The king's personal guard stood in perfect, unmoving formation around the transport, their faces devoid of emotion, their hands resting loosely on the hilts of their blades. Valerius emerged from the heavy oak doors of the keep. He descended the ancient stone steps, moving with the lethal grace of a sovereign in absolute control. He was carrying Senna effortlessly against his armored chest. She was still wrapped securely in his massive obsidian cloak, safely tucked away from the biting wind and the prying eyes of her abusers. Her silver-grey eyes remained quiet, calm, absorbing the cold light of day from the safety of his arms. She did not look back. At the base of the stairs, Garrick stood trembling. The cowardly father was pale and sweating despite the freezing temperature. He clutched a rolled piece of thick parchment in his fist. The Silver Treaty, the very legal document that was supposed to bind the Frostwood Pack to King Valerius's crown, exchanging a beautiful daughter for immense wealth and protection. The monarch paused. He extended a single commanding hand. The invisible, crushing pressure in the courtyard shifted just enough to allow Garrick to step forward. The Alpha's hands shook violently as he surrendered the scroll. Valerius took the thick, wax-sealed parchment without a word of thanks. He did not bother to unroll it. He did not read the terms. He simply snapped the heavy, stamped wax seal with a flick of his armored thumb. With a slow, deliberate, and agonizingly visible motion, the towering ruler tore the parchment directly down the middle. The sharp sound of tearing premium parchment echoed like a singular gunshot in the silent, paralyzed morning. He ripped the halves again, and then again. He let the shredded, useless pieces fall like dead, forgotten leaves onto the snow. The alliance was annulled. The Frostwood Pack's future was effectively obliterated in seconds. A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do, and you do it anyway. The Conqueror spoke. His voice carried the fatal, chilling finality of a falling executioner's blade. He stared down at Garrick, and then past him to Morgana and Elara, who watched helplessly from the icy balcony above. You made your choices regarding how you treat what is inherently mine now. I will make mine. I reject this bond with your house. He turned his broad back on the ruined family. He did not ask for a traditional dowry. He did not attempt to negotiate a new, secondary alliance. He carried Senna toward the open door of the obsidian carriage, stepping over the scattered fragments of the torn treaty. This one, Valerius declared to the vast, trembling court. His voice echoed fiercely off the frozen stone, so every soul could hear his unalterable decree. She is the undisputed bride. She is the true queen of the North. And if a single individual in this miserable, rotting fortress breathes a word against her, I will leave no stone standing upon another. He climbed into the carriage, bringing the heat and the darkness with him, and shut the heavy door on the Frostwood Pack forever. The heavy iron latch clicked into place, a definitive severing. The interior of the obsidian carriage was entirely carved from ancient Gothic wealth. Dark mahogany panelled the curved walls, intricately detailed with the crests of the founding packs. Thick, enchanted glass completely negated the lethal winter of the Northern Territories, trapping a sweltering, magical heat inside the cabin. The transition from the freezing courtyard of her abusers to this opulent sanctuary was violent, disorienting. For 20 years, her only experience with enclosed spaces involved the damp, rat-infested coal cellar, where Morgana Frostwood routinely locked her away for the crime of breathing too loudly. Senna pressed her spine rigidly against the plush leather seating. Her pulse hammered. Every breath felt like drawing shards of ice. She kept her hands tucked tightly beneath the heavy fur cloak, terrified of ruining the immaculate cushions with the grime of her servitude. Opposite her, the Alpha King took his seat. The sheer overwhelming mass of his physical form seemed to consume all the available oxygen. Valerius was not a man built for confined spaces. His broad shoulders spanned the width of the bench, his armored legs stretched out. Yet he did not crowd her. The terrifying predator deliberately kept his battle-scarred hands resting firmly on his own thighs. Quiet, calculated, still. Her heart slammed against her ribs with every revolution of the carriage wheels. 2 decades of bruises and locked cellars had carved a singular truth into her bones. Safety was a lie, a cruel prelude to a much harsher punishment. She fully expected the vehicle to bypass the royal quarters and descend directly into a subterranean dungeon. Half-breeds were not taken as brides. Useless, discarded servants were used for target practice or fed to the military warhounds. She squeezed her silver-grey eyes shut, waiting for the inevitable moment when the cruelty would begin. The sovereign watched the frantic, shallow rise and fall of her chest. The agony of sensing her raw terror radiating through the fated bond was suffocating. Caring about you is killing me. His inner beast snarled silently, clawing at his ribs in a desperate, primal urge to erase her fear. He reached toward a recessed compartment built into the dark timber paneling. The metallic click made the girl flinch violently. He did not draw a blade. Instead, he withdrew a gleaming silver basin. He placed the metal bowl securely on the small, reinforced table separating their seats. Next, he unstoppered a heavy thermal flask, pouring a steady stream of steaming, crystal-clear water into the vessel. The soothing scent of crushed lavender and warm cedar instantly filled the cabin, actively combating the sharp, metallic tang of her lingering terror. He retrieved a pristine, folded silk cloth from a velvet-lined drawer. "Look at me," the monarch murmured. The command was not a roar, it was a low, vibrating rumble that resonated directly in the marrow of her bones. Senna forced her eyes open, her breath hitched. The turbulent silver gaze of the ruler was entirely stripped of the glacial wrath he had unleashed upon the Frostwood court. It was consumed by a terrifying, burning devotion. He dipped the delicate fabric into the steaming water. He wrung it out with careful, deliberate movements of his massive hands. Then he leaned forward. She instinctively recoiled, her shoulders hiking up to protect her neck. Valerius froze instantly. He did not force the contact. He held the damp material suspended in the air, allowing her erratic heartbeat a moment to settle. "I will not strike you," he stated, the gravel in his voice completely masking the underlying devastation of seeing her defensive posture. "I will never strike you. I am only going to wash the ash from your skin." She swallowed hard, the knot in her throat threatening to choke her. Slowly, agonizingly, she lowered her shoulders a fraction of an inch. The first touch of the heated fabric against her soot-stained cheek sent a full-body shiver down her spine. It was not pain. It was the shocking, unfamiliar sensation of deep, unyielding gentleness. The king moved the cloth with painstaking care. He wiped away the dark streaks of charcoal and dirt she had been forced to wear like a brand of shame. He traced the delicate line of her jaw, the slope of her nose, the curve of her forehead. Every stroke was a silent, reverent apology. When he finished with her face, he gently coaxed her trembling hands out from beneath the fur garment. The jagged cuts on her palms had already begun to knit together, accelerated by the latent power of the biological link, but the skin was still coated in dried blood. He washed each finger individually. He cleaned the deep crevices of her palms. He did not avert his gaze from the raised, intricate dormant runes etched into her forearms. He did not look at the jagged lines with disgust. He traced the ancient, slumbering magic with the pad of his thumb, a silent acknowledgement of her hidden worth. "They burned you," the conqueror whispered, his jaw clenching as he noted the faded, silver lines of older abuse layered beneath the grime. "They tried to freeze the life out of you." Senna stared down at their joined hands. The contrast between his immense, lethal power and her fragile, scarred frame was staggering, yet the ambient heat radiating from his skin felt like a localized sun, thawing the decades of ice accumulated in her soul. "I am broken," she finally spoke, her voice a raspy, disused whisper that cracked in the quiet cabin, a desperate attempt to offer him a chance to realize his error before it was too late. "I have nothing. I am nothing." He stopped, wiping her skin. The Alpha dropped the ruined fabric into the metal bowl. He lifted both of her clean, trembling hands and pressed them firmly against the center of his armored chest, right over the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," Valerius vowed. The fierce certainty in his tone left no room for debate. "There is no wolf too broken to be worthy. You are not broken. You are simply unfinished, and you are mine." 3 days passed in a blur of continuous motion and quiet isolation. The royal transport ascended the treacherous, winding spine of the world, a mountain range so brutal that lesser wolves frequently froze to death attempting to cross its lower passes. Yet, within the moving sanctuary of the carriage, the girl experienced a complete suspension of reality. She was fed warm, rich broths, wrapped in layers of exquisite furs. She slept securely within the unyielding perimeter of her mate's protective aura, completely untouched by the lethal cold raging outside. On the twilight of the 3rd day, the vehicle began to slow. The distinct rhythmic clatter of the horse's hooves shifted from packed snow to solid, echoing cobblestone. She shifted nervously on the leather bench, peering through the small, reinforced window. Her breath hitched, fogging the pain. Rising from the jagged, black rocks of the mountainside was the ancestral seat of the Winter Kings. The massive, dark Gothic fortress of Shadowspire Castle loomed against the darkening sky like a dormant titan. A terrifying architectural masterpiece of sharp, towering spires, deeply carved gargoyles, and sheer, impenetrable obsidian walls. The stronghold possessed 3 concentric rings of defensive battlements, separated by deep, frozen moats. The sheer scale of the architecture was designed to instantly crush the morale of any approaching enemy. It looked less like a palace and more like a beautifully crafted cage for a monster. The old terror seized her lungs with a renewed, vicious grip. A fortress of this monumental magnitude was built on brutal discipline and military punishment. It inevitably housed subterranean cells, freezing dungeons where unwanted prisoners were forgotten by the light of day. She gripped the edges of her cloak. Her knuckles turned white. The gentle treatment during the journey had merely been a temporary reprieve, a sedating tactic. Now she would be handed over to the slave masters, sent to the lowest scullery to scrub the freezing flagstones until her fingers bled. She locked her emotions behind the familiar, cold barrier of silence. The carriage rolled to a definitive halt. Outside, the heavy iron-wrought Gothic gates groaned in protest, the massive hinges screeching as they were pulled open by unseen mechanisms. The sound was deafening, echoing off the high stone walls of the outer bailey. The door clicked open. Valerius stepped out first. His boots hit the freezing courtyard with a heavy, authoritative thud. The howling wind immediately whipped at his dark hair, but he ignored the elements completely. He turned back, reaching a large open hand into the dark interior of the cabin. Senna hesitated. She stared at his offered palm, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she placed her small hand in his. He effortlessly lifted her down from the high step, ensuring her feet found secure purchase on the icy ground before releasing her waist. He did not pull her behind him like a captive. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, his massive frame deliberately positioned to block the harshest bite of the wind. The shadow finally looked up, taking in the full scope of the inner courtyard. She stopped breathing entirely. The vast, sweeping expanse of the bailey was not empty. It was packed wall to wall with the terrifying military might of the Northern Empire. Thousands of elite guards stood in perfectly aligned rigid formations, clad in heavy black iron armor, their faces obscured by helmets, their massive weapons resting at their sides. Flanking the military ranks were hundreds of high-ranking household staff, dressed in immaculate, dark woolen uniforms, an entire legion of apex predators. A sea of hardened, lethal wolves who had conquered neighboring kingdoms and slaughtered rival packs without mercy. She shrank back instinctively, terrified by the sheer volume of dangerous, focused attention directed at her. The king did not speak. He merely raised a single armored hand. The response was instantaneous and earth-shattering. As one singular entity, the entire legion moved. Thousands of heavily armed warriors dropped to one knee. The synchronized, deafening crash of iron, striking the frozen flagstones, created a shockwave that vibrated through the soles of her boots. The metallic impact was followed by a silence so heavy, so unyielding, it felt as though the entire mountain had stopped breathing. The household staff immediately followed suit, bowing their heads deeply, exposing the vulnerable napes of their necks in the ultimate display of unquestioning submission. Not a single weapon was drawn. Not a single voice was raised in protest. The terrifying, undefeated army of the North had willingly lowered themselves to the freezing earth. Senna stood completely paralyzed. Her silver-grey eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. She looked from the kneeling warriors to the dark, towering walls, and finally up at the man standing beside her. No one had ever bowed to her. She had spent 2 decades being shoved into corners, kicked, silenced, and forced to kneel in the dirt for the amusement of lesser wolves. The invisible half-breed, the useless, scarred embarrassment. Yet here, in the most feared fortress in the known world, an empire was prostrating itself before her dirty, soot-stained boots. "Observe them," the Alpha murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble near her ear. He did not look at his army. He watched her face, his eyes burning with fierce pride. "They do not bow to me today. They bow to their Luna, to their queen." He reached out, his knuckles gently grazing the line of her jaw. "This is your home. These are your walls. These are your shields. No one will ever force you into the shadows again." The icy, suffocating knot of terror that had ruled her entire existence began to fracture. A strange, unfamiliar warmth flooded her chest, rising up to sting the backs of her eyes. She did not weep. She had long ago forgotten how to shed tears, but the physical sensation of sudden, encompassing safety was entirely overwhelming. The wind howled against the high spires, but the sovereign did not allow her to stand in the cold for long. Without waiting for the frozen courtyard to rise, he scooped her up into his arms once more. He carried her past the kneeling ranks, striding purposefully through the massive, arched entrance of the keep. The interior of the stronghold was a stark contrast to its brutal exterior. The grand halls were expansive and echoing, built of dark, polished marble and lit by hundreds of massive, roaring hearths. The air was thick with the scent of burning pine, melted beeswax, and old, rich leather. Massive woven tapestries hung from the vaulted ceilings, depicting the ancient, forgotten myths of the sunborn weavers, a dormant magic that she carried entirely unaware beneath her scarred skin. It was not a damp, rotting ruin. It was opulent, immaculate, and vibrating with latent power. He bypassed the public audience chambers entirely, ascending a sweeping, spiraling staircase that led directly into the restricted, private heart of the royal wing. Valerius pushed open a set of heavy, intricately carved double doors. They stepped into the master suite. The sheer scale of the room was breathtaking. A cavernous sanctuary draped in heavy velvet and dark silk. A massive stone fireplace dominated the far wall, radiating a fierce, localized heat that immediately banished the chill from her bones. Tall, arched windows overlooked the jagged mountain peaks, the glass thick enough to mute the raging blizzard outside to a low, distant hum. The monarch walked to the center of the room and gently set her down. She stood before a magnificent, high-backed golden velvet chair. The plush, luxurious material was completely alien to a girl who had spent her life sitting on damp hay and unforgiving stone floors. She reached out a trembling hand. Her fingertips brushed the soft, vibrant fabric, half expecting it to vanish like a cruel mirage. Before she could process the sheer wealth surrounding her, the heavy doors opened again. A select group of individuals entered the suite, moving with quiet, disciplined grace. At the forefront was a tall, severely scarred man wearing the insignia of the captain of the guard. Beside him stood an older, stern-faced woman carrying the heavy ring of keys that denoted the head housekeeper. Behind them filed a dozen high-ranking attendants, their eyes fixed respectfully on the floor. Valerius stepped behind the luxurious seat, his large hands resting possessively on its high back. He did not sit. He stood as her personal shield, his presence commanding silence from the room.
"Acknowledge your queen,"
the sovereign commanded. His voice brooked no hesitation. The staff and the commander lifted their heads, taking in the small, exhausted girl wrapped in the oversized cloak. There was no judgment in their eyes, no whispered mockery, no hidden disgust, only quiet, focused reverence. From this breath forward, the Alpha declared, his tone cutting through the warm air like a sharpened blade. Her word is law within these walls and across my territories. Her command supersedes my own. If she asks for the sun, you will tear it from the sky. If she requires blood, you will bleed. He turned his intense gaze directly onto the head housekeeper. Send word to the finest silk spinners in the capital. Every rag she wore in the south is to be burned immediately. She will be draped in nothing but the highest quality fabrics the Empire can produce. Her meals will be prepared before my own. Anyone who brings her distress, anyone who causes her to doubt her safety, will answer to my claws. Is this understood? Yes, my king. Yes, my queen. The chorus of voices answered in perfect, unwavering unison. The older woman stepped forward, executing a flawless, deep curtsy. The fortress is yours to command, your majesty. We live to serve your peace. Senna stared at the assembly, Her mind struggled to grasp the monumental shift in her reality. She was neither a tool nor a captive, but a sovereign equal. She was not a prisoner. She was not a disposable tool. She had been handed the keys to an empire by the most dangerous man alive. The king dismissed the staff with a sharp nod. They filed out of the room instantly, pulling the heavy doors shut behind them, leaving the couple completely alone in the sprawling sanctuary. The moment the latch clicked, the terrifying, ruthless conqueror vanished. Valerius stepped around the chair. He did not loom over her. He sank to his knees on the thick, woven rug, bringing his eyes level with her waist. He reached out, gently taking both of her hands in his. "You are safe," he whispered, the raw sincerity in his voice, stripping away the last of her defensive barriers. "You have abundance here. You will never know hunger. You will never know the cold, and you will never, ever be overlooked again." She looked down into the storm-grey eyes of her mate. She saw the quiet truth anchored in his soul. The years of abuse, the biting mockery of Alara, the cruel indifference of Garrick, all of it shattered against the unyielding bedrock of his devotion. Her final internal barricades dissolved entirely. Her trembling fingers slipped from his grasp. She reached out. Her small, scarred hands gently cupped the rugged, battle-hardened angles of his face. It was her first voluntary gesture of physical contact, a silent, terrifying surrender to the bond. Valerius exhaled a ragged, shaking breath. He leaned his heavy head entirely into her fragile touch, completely at the mercy of the shadow he had crowned as his son. The quiet intimacy of the monarch, kneeling before his newly claimed mate, was suspended in the heavy, warm air of the sanctuary. For a fleeting moment, the vast, violent universe shrank down to the solitary radius of their shared breaths. But the absolute stillness was abruptly shattered by a soft, rhythmic knock at the heavy double doors. Valerius stiffened. He did not pull away from her fragile touch abruptly, but the terrifying alpha predator instantly resurfaced from the depths of his vulnerable surrender. His broad shoulders squared. The ambient temperature in the cavernous room plummeted a fraction as his protective instincts flared, instantly forming an invisible, lethal perimeter around the golden velvet chair where she sat. "Enter," the king commanded. His voice was a low, vibrating threat that promised immediate violence to anyone who dared disturb the delicate peace he had just constructed. The heavy oak doors clicked open with a metallic groan. A man stepped into the royal suite. He did not wear the black iron armor of the military legion, nor the immaculate woolen uniforms of the household staff. Caelan Vance moved with a clinical, calculated grace, his dark, sweeping robes making absolutely no sound across the thick carpets. Clutched securely under his right arm was a massive, ancient book secured by iron clasps, the healer's ledger of the Stormvanger dynasty, a sacred tome containing the biological histories and deepest secrets of every royal lineage in the Northern Territories. The physician bowed deeply, exposing his vulnerable throat to the sovereign in a flawless display of absolute submission. Before his pale, highly observant eyes flicked toward the small, soot-stained figure sitting in the oversized chair, Cena's stomach instantly dropped, a cold, intensely familiar spike of terror pierced through the lingering warmth of the mate bond. Healers in the southern pack had never meant comfort. They had only ever visited the dark scullery to ensure she was physically capable of scrubbing the massive iron grates for another grueling week. They mended shattered collarbones just enough so she could carry heavy buckets of well water without collapsing. They stitched deep cuts without the mercy of numbing herbs, their faces constantly twisted in disgust at having to touch the filthy, supposedly useless half-breed. Healing, in her 20 years of brutal existence, was merely a painful precursor to more labor. She instinctively shrank back against the plush upholstery, her hands dropping from the king's rugged face to curl tightly in her lap. The sovereign sensed the violent, sudden spike of her anxiety. The biological link flared in his chest, a sharp, localized pain mirroring her terror. He placed a warm, heavy hand over her white-knuckled fingers, a silent, unyielding anchor. "He is here to mend, not to harm," the Alpha murmured, his gaze entirely focused on her pale, panicked face. "If he causes you even a fraction of pain, I will throw him off the highest parapet of this fortress." KLN did not flinch at the casual, entirely genuine threat of execution. He approached the mahogany table nearby and carefully set the heavy book down. The crisp, aged parchment rustled loudly in the quiet room as he undid the iron clasps and opened it to a blank page. He retrieved a sharpened charcoal pencil from his pocket. "With your permission, my queen," the doctor spoke. His voice was completely devoid of the mocking condescension she was accustomed to hearing from southern healers. It was smooth, detached, and deeply respectful. "I need to evaluate your vitals. Your physical deprivation is severe, and the transition to this extreme altitude requires careful biological management." The girl gave a jerky, terrified nod. The evaluation was meticulous and entirely devoid of cruelty. The healer kept a respectful distance, using purely observational expertise to examine the hollows of her cheeks, the fragile protrusion of her collarbones beneath the oversized fur cloak, and the shallow, erratic rhythm of her breathing. He documented her severe malnutrition with sharp, precise strokes of his pencil against the ledger. He noted the obvious vitamin deficiencies, the chronic exhaustion, and the systemic shock her body was currently fighting. Then, his pale eyes fell upon the jagged, raised tissue peeking out from the sleeves of her garment. "May I examine your arms?" the physician asked, his tone dropping an octave, becoming sharply focused. She hesitated. Her breath hitched. The intricate, overlapping scars on her forearms were her greatest source of agonizing shame. Morgana Frostwood had always ensured the heavy, glowing iron pokers from the grand hearth found their way to Senna's skin whenever the girl accidentally displayed any sign of the pack's inherent physical strength. "You are defective," the cruel stepmother used to hiss as the hot metal seared her flesh, filling the kitchen with the sickening scent of burning hair. "I am merely burning away the rot." Valerius gave her a slow, encouraging nod, the absolute, unwavering trust radiating from his storm-grey eyes gave her the courage to pull the heavy fabric back. She exposed her wrists to the harsh light of the roaring fireplace. The doctor did not recoil in disgust. He did not sneer at the ugly, mottled texture of her ruined skin. Instead, the scratching sound of his charcoal pencil stopped entirely. Kalen leaned closer, his brow furrowing in deep analytical concentration. He narrowed his eyes, tracking the geometric trajectory of the raised lines without actually making physical contact. The silence in the room stretched until it became suffocating. "They told you these were burns from the hearth coals," the physician murmured. It wasn't a question. It was a dark, horrifying realization. The shadow nodded once, staring down at her lap. Kalen snapped the thick book shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot off the dark stone walls, his clinical composure completely fractured, replaced by a cold, simmering outrage that made the air in the room crackle with static electricity. He looked up, bypassing his patient entirely to lock eyes with his sovereign. "Ignorance breeds accidents, but malice acts with full awareness," the royal healer stated, his voice laced with the lethal venom aimed entirely southward across the borders. Garrick and his vicious wife knew exactly what they were trying to destroy. "These are not thermal burns, my king." Valerius slowly rose to his feet. His massive, terrifying frame blocked the flickering light of the fire. "Explain." "They are dormant runes," Kalen breathed, his detachment entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute reverence. The ancient biological dialect of the Sunborn Weavers, a magic so old it predates the founding packs. The Southern Alpha did not burn her to punish her clumsiness. They systematically seared her flesh for 2 decades to keep the magic trapped beneath layers of thick scar tissue. They tried to burn a goddess down to a scullery maid out of sheer pathetic terror of what she would inevitably become. Senna's lungs stopped working. Oxygen simply refused to pass her paralyzed vocal cords. The physician was dismissed shortly after to gather specialized, rare ointments from the deep healing vaults, leaving the heavy ledger resting closed on the table. The huge doors shut behind him, and the master suite descended back into a profound, ringing silence. She sat completely frozen in the golden chair. The revelation hung heavily in the sweltering air, dismantling every fundamental truth she had ever been taught about her own miserable existence. She was not a defective, wolfless half-breed. She was a biological anomaly, a living, breathing relic of a sacred bloodline that the entire continent believed to be extinct. The brutal beatings, the starvation, the endless years locked in the pitch-black cellar. It was not because she was fundamentally worthless. It was because she was a monumental threat to the very foundation of their rigid pack hierarchy. Outside the thick, enchanted glass, the violent northern blizzard finally broke. The heavy, oppressive cloud cover fractured, revealing the massive, brilliant disk of the winter moon. The pure lunar light pierced the tall arched windows, spilling across the dark velvet carpets in a stark, blinding beam of silver. An inexplicable, gravity-defying pull tugged at the center of her chest, a physical tether dragging her toward the illumination. Moving like a woman caught in a deep trance, Sina pushed herself up from the plush upholstery and stepped out from the protective shadow of the monarch. The moment the moonlight touched her bare, scarred forearms, the universe tilted. It did not hurt. There was no burning agony, no searing repetition of the iron pokers. Instead, it was a sudden, violent rushing sensation, like a massive dam breaking inside her veins. The raised, jagged tissue on her arms began to hum. A low, vibrating frequency resonated through her bones, sinking down into the floorboards and rattling the fine crystal goblets resting on the stone mantel. Valerius watched in stunned, absolute silence. He did not intervene. He recognized the profound sacredness of the moment unfolding before him. The scars ignited. The dormant runes flared to life with a brilliant, blinding silver-blue light. The ancient symbols shattered the physical limitations of her old trauma, projecting intricate, spinning geometric patterns onto the dark mahogany walls of the suite. The luminescent energy crawled rapidly up her wrists, swirling over her bruised shoulders, and outlining the delicate structure of her collarbones in pure, liquid starlight. The ambient shadows of the cavernous room were instantly obliterated. The crushing, cold weight of her lifelong abuse, the suffocating memory of Morgana's cruel laughter, evaporated entirely in the searing, majestic heat of her own awakening magic. She gasped, her spine arching as the dormant power of the sunborn ancestors erupted outward. The air pressure in the room dropped drastically, heavy with the sharp scent of ozone and burning cedar. 20 years of suppressed, god-tier energy rushed into her nervous system, knitting microscopic bone fractures, erasing internal bruising, and flooding her starved muscles with an impossible, terrifying strength. The Alpha King did not shield his eyes from the blinding radiance. He stepped directly into the explosive aura. The Sovereign reached out and firmly grasped her glowing wrists. The magic did not repel him. It did not scorch his battle-hardened skin. The ancient power instantly recognized the biological signature of the fated link. It recognized its sworn protector. The silver-blue light curled affectionately around Valerius's massive forearms, weaving their rapid pulses together in a flawless, unbreakable rhythm. He looked down at her, his storm-grey eyes completely devoid of the ruthless arrogance that usually defined his bloody rule. He gazed at her not as a broken victim he had rescued from the ashes, but as a supreme deity he was immensely privileged to worship. Slowly, the overwhelming surge of raw power settled into a steady, pulsing warmth beneath her flesh. The blinding, room-filling light dimmed to a soft, ethereal luminescence that continued to glow faintly from the intricate lines mapping her skin. Valerius kept his unyielding grip on her hands. Without a single word, he slowly began to walk backward, guiding her toward the far end of the sanctuary. He reached out with one armored hand and unlatched the heavy wrought-iron mechanisms holding the massive exterior glass doors shut. He pushed them wide open. They stepped out together onto the vast, sweeping expanse of the royal balcony. The freezing, lethal northern wind immediately slammed into them, a howling gale that would have stripped the heat from a normal wolf in a matter of seconds. But Sina did not shiver. The ancient magic coursing through her veins projected a localized, invisible barrier of intense summer heat, violently repelling the brutal winter chill before it could even touch her silk garments. From this dizzying precipice, the entire world was laid bare. The sprawling, jagged peaks of the spine of the world stretched out endlessly beneath the silver moon. The dark, impenetrable pine forests of the northern territories blanketed the deep valleys below in a sea of black needles. Dotted across the vast, frozen landscape were the glowing watchfires of 1,000 military encampments. Tens of thousands of lethal warriors, all burning their torches for the monarch who stood at her side. "Look at it," Valerius commanded softly. He stepped behind her, wrapping his massive arms securely around her glowing waist and pulling her back against the solid wall of his chest. He rested his chin gently against the crown of her head, his warm breath ghosting over her ear. All of it, every mountain peak, every dark forest, every beating heart in this realm, it answers to you. She looked down at the terrifying, magnificent kingdom. She was no longer the invisible, silent shadow kneeling in the soot of the Frostwood Keep. She was not waiting in breathless terror for the heavy footsteps of a cruel father who actively despised her existence. The severed alliance was meant to be her final undoing. Morgana had intended for her to die, a nameless, forgotten servant in the dark, her tremendous magic buried forever beneath a jagged cage of seared flesh and hardened, scentless burned tissue. Instead, she stood at the absolute pinnacle of the known world, wearing the literal magic of the gods on her skin, held securely by a terrifying monster who would gladly shatter the earth to keep her safe. Revered rather than commanded, worshipped rather than possessed. The phantom iron chains that had choked her throat for 2 decades finally snapped. The lingering, toxic echoes of the southern pack's cruelty dissolved into the howling northern wind, completely powerless against the roaring, undeniable fire of her own supreme worth. She leaned her head back against the unyielding shoulder of her mate, closing her silver-grey eyes as the moonlight bathed them both in its quiet glory. The terrified, abused scullery maid was dead. She was the brilliant light to his imposing shadow, the undisputed, magical queen of his eternal winter. The grand hearth in the southern keep is likely cold now. They say the Frostwood Pack still looks over their trembling shoulders every time the wind howls, waiting in sheer terror for the storm to finally come and collect the bloody debt of their cruelty. But the story of the scarred servant who became a sunborn queen does not end in vengeance and endless warfare. It ends in the light. It ends in the quiet, undeniable triumph of a soul that absolutely refused to be extinguished.